snow fell thick and soundless that Christmas night, blanketing the world in an eerie, suffocating quiet. I sat by the fireplace in my small, weathered home, the flames casting flickering shadows across the walls. Though the warmth seeped into my bones, a chill lingered in the air, unshakable. Outside, the wind moaned faintly, its voice distant yet persistent, as if calling from another world. I was just drifting into the embrace of sleep when it began. The melody. It started softly, a series of lilting notes that seemed to hang in the stillness, too delicate to be real. My heart stumbled in its rhythm, the familiarity of the tune striking a chord deep within me. It was Jonathan's Serenade. He used to play it every Christmas, his violin singing beneath the glow of our modest tree. It was his favorite piece, a hauntingly beautiful composition that had filled our small home with joy and warmth. But Jonathan was gone, had been for nearly a decade. His death had been sudden, a cruel twist of fate that left me with an empty bed and a fractured soul. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the phantom melody as my imagination, an echo of grief that still lingered after all these years. But the notes grew louder, weaving their way through the thick silence of the night. They drifted up from outside, unmistakable in their clarity, as though the violinist stood directly beneath my window. My heart pounding, I rose from my chair and approached the frost-tinged glass. With trembling hands, I pulled aside the curtain and peered into the night. My breath caught in my throat. There he was. Jonathan stood in the falling snow, his violin tucked beneath his chin, the bow gliding gracefully across the strings. His silhouette shimmered, ethereal and faintly glowing, as if formed from the very moonlight that bathed him. His face, though partially obscured by the swirling snow, was unmistakable. The sharp jawline, the slight furrow in his brow, the intensity in his eyes. But his gaze was distant, unfocused, as if he were seeing something far beyond this world. "Jonathan," I whispered, my voice trembling. The serenade continued uninterrupted, the melody piercing and mournful. The shadows cast by the flickering flames seemed to stretch and distort as the music filled the room, crawling across the walls like living things. The air grew colder, each breath leaving a cloud that lingered far too long before dissipating. Against every instinct that screamed at me to stay inside, I opened the window. A rush of frigid air surged in, biting at my skin and extinguishing the fire. The night swallowed the room, and I leaned out, calling his name again, louder this time. He paused, his head tilted ever so slightly in my direction, and for a moment, his gaze locked with mine. His eyes, once so warm and familiar, now shimmered with a cold, spectral light. A tremor ran through me, but before I could speak again, he lowered his bow and began to retreat into the swirling snow, the melody fading with each step. "Wait!" I cried, but he didn't stop. His figure dissolved into the storm, leaving me alone with the suffocating silence. The violin's final note lingered in the air, a ghostly whisper that seemed to echo within my chest. I slammed the window shut and stumbled back into the darkened room, my breath shallow and uneven. Whatever had just happened, it wasn't a dream. Jonathan had returned. The next morning, I found myself standing at the edge of the cemetery, the snow crunching beneath my boots. The storm had passed, leaving the world a blinding expanse of white beneath a pale winter sun. My heart thudded heavily as I approached Jonathan's grave, the familiar ache of loss tightening in my chest. His tombstone was simple but dignified, bearing his name and the dates that marked the short span of his life. It was undisturbed, the snow around it unbroken, no sign of the ghostly figure I had seen the night before. For a moment I thought I'd imagined it all, but then I saw it. A single wilted rose lay atop the grave, its petals blackened and curled as though burned. Beside it was a scrap of parchment, yellowed with age and marked by a spidery scrawl that made my stomach churn. The handwriting was Jonathan's. My hands trembled as I picked it up, brushing off the snow. The words were brief but chilling. The final serenade must be played. The words sent a jolt of fear through me, a fear I couldn't explain. I had never known Jonathan to be superstitious or cryptic in life. Why now, from beyond the grave, would he leave such a message? That evening, the whispers began. At first they were faint, barely audible over the creak of the house and the whistle of the wind. But as the night wore on, they grew louder, more insistent. They didn't form words, but their tone was unmistakable, mournful, accusing. The sound seemed to emanate from the locked cabinet in the corner of the room, the one that held Jonathan's violin. I had left it untouched since his death, unable to bear the sight of it. Now the whispers seemed to call me to it, a chilling pull that sent shivers racing down my spine. When I could no longer ignore it, I approached the cabinet, my legs heavy as lead. The whispers grew deafening, a chorus of lament that filled my ears and drowned out all other sound. With trembling hands, I unlocked the cabinet and pulled it open. Jonathan's violin lay inside, untouched but pristine, its strings gleaming faintly in the dim light. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. My hands hovered over the instrument, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. I slammed the cabinet shut and backed away, my heart racing. Whatever this was, it wasn't natural. Something dark was stirring, and I was at its center. The whispers didn't return the following night, but their absence was far from comforting. The silence that replaced them was worse, a heavy, stifling quiet that wrapped itself around the house and filled every corner with dread. I felt watched, though I was utterly alone. The shadows seemed darker, their edges sharp and deliberate, as if they had intent. The violin remained locked away, yet I couldn't stop thinking about it. The melody haunted me, playing endlessly in my mind, the notes intertwining with my thoughts until I couldn't distinguish one from the other. It followed me to the market, where I caught myself humming it under my breath. It crept into my dreams, twisting them into nightmares where Jonathan's ghost stood over me, playing the tune with a hollow gaze. By the third night, I couldn't resist any longer. The weight of the message, the final serenade must be played, had become unbearable. I had to understand what it meant. If there was any chance of freeing myself from this curse, I knew it lay with the violin. I unlocked the cabinet with shaking hands and removed the instrument, its polished wood cool to the touch. It felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried something more than its physical form. The bow trembled in my grip as I sat down and positioned the violin beneath my chin. The first note sliced through the silence, sharp and mournful. The sound was richer than I remembered, filling the room with an almost physical presence. As I played, the melody poured out of me effortlessly, as though my fingers were guided by an unseen force. It was Jonathan's serenade, but darker, its beauty tainted by something sinister, as if it had been warped by time and death. The room seemed to shift as I played, the walls closing in, the shadows thickening. A cold wind swept through, extinguishing the fire and plunging the room into darkness. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. And then I felt it. A presence. Jonathan appeared in the corner of the room, his translucent form shimmering faintly in the moonlight. His eyes locked onto mine, filled with sorrow and something darker, an unspoken warning. "Why are you here?" I whispered, my voice breaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he lifted his hand and pointed to the violin, his expression grave. The melody faltered, and in that instant, the room erupted into chaos. The shadows surged forward, writhing and twisting like living things. The air grew heavy, pressing against my chest and making it difficult to breathe. The violin screeched as my bow scraped across the strings, the sound jagged and unnatural. Jonathan's lips moved, but no sound came out. His hand reached toward me, his ghostly fingers inches from the violin. I jerked back instinctively, and the bow slipped from my grasp, clattering to the floor. The room stilled, the shadows retreating to the edges like a tide pulling back. Jonathan's form began to fade, his expression shifting to one of profound regret. His voice finally came, a soft whisper that seemed to echo from the depths of the grave. "Finish it, before it's too late." And then he was gone, leaving me alone with the violin and the suffocating weight of his words. Jonathan's plea echoed in my mind long after his ghost had vanished. Finish it. But what was there to finish? The melody was complete, every note perfectly aligned with the version he'd played in life. Yet I knew deep down that this was no ordinary piece of music. It was a ritual, a summoning, a trap. That night, I pored over every memory I had of Jonathan, searching for some clue that might explain the Serenade's dark purpose. My thoughts drifted to the stories he used to tell, tales of his childhood spent in a distant village steeped in superstition. He had once spoken of a cursed violin, an heirloom passed down through his family, said to bind the soul of its player if used under the Christmas moon. I had laughed at the story then, dismissing it as mere folklore. Now the memory chilled me to the core. Midnight approached, the house cloaked in an unnatural stillness. The air was heavy with anticipation, as if the very walls were holding their breath. I knew what I hate you. I knew what I had to do. If there was a way to end this nightmare, it lay in completing the final serenade. I lit a single candle and sat in the center of the room, the violin resting in my lap. The shadows danced around me, their movements erratic and menacing, but I forced myself to focus. The first note rang out, pure and haunting, and the shadows froze. I played with precision, each note piercing the oppressive silence. As the melody unfolded, the air around me grew colder, the candle's flame flickering violently. And then, they came. Shadows began to materialize, coalescing into forms, twisted and unnatural, with faces obscured by darkness. They encircled me, their presence heavy and suffocating. Jonathan appeared among them, his form shimmering with a strange, sorrowful light. The violin strings burned beneath my fingers, the melody taking on a life of its own. I felt as though I were no longer playing but being played, my body a mere vessel for the cursed music. The shadows loomed closer, their hollow eyes fixed on me with unrelenting hunger. With a final desperate push, I reached the last note. The sound exploded into the room, reverberating like a scream. The shadows recoiled, their forms unraveling into wisps of darkness. Jonathan stepped forward, his expression softening as he reached out to touch my hand. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice faint but filled with relief. As his form dissolved into the light, the shadows vanished entirely, leaving me alone in the stillness. The violin fell silent, its strings snapping one by one. The curse was broken, or so I thought. The violin lay shattered at my feet, its strings coiled like tiny, lifeless serpents. I sat motionless in the center of the room, the candle flickering weakly beside me, casting faint and fragmented shadows across the walls. The air was still, heavy with the echoes of Jonathan's final words. "Thank you." But the relief I'd expected didn't come. The house remained unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that feels alive, teeming with unspoken malice. The candle's flame sputtered violently before extinguishing altogether, plunging the room into darkness. A chill crept over me, more biting than the winter air outside. It wrapped around my chest, squeezing until each breath felt like a struggle. I stumbled to my feet, my pulse quickening as I scanned the room. Shadows slithered across the walls, darker than before, their movements unnatural and deliberate. They didn't writhe or twist as they had earlier. They watched. I grabbed the broken violin and fled, the jagged remains clutched tightly in my trembling hands. Outside, the snow fell softly, its stillness a stark contrast to the turmoil inside me. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light illuminating the graveyard ahead. My instincts drove me toward Jonathan's grave, though I couldn't explain why. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I approached, the sound unnaturally loud in the suffocating silence. The grave looked different now, disturbed. The earth was freshly churned, dark and wet against the pristine snow. Atop it sat the withered rose, its petals blackened and curling inward like claws. I bent down, my hands shaking as I reached for the rose. But before I could touch it, a voice, low and guttural, rippled through the night. "You should have let him stay." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating in the air like a sinister vibration. The ground beneath me trembled, and a faint mist began to rise from the disturbed earth, curling and coalescing into a shape. Jonathan. But this wasn't the Jonathan I knew, nor the ghostly figure that had appeared in my home. This form was twisted, wrong, his face gaunt and sunken, his eyes hollow pits of darkness. His once graceful hands, the hands that had coaxed beauty from the violin, were now clawed and trembling, dripping with shadow. "You played the final serenade," he said, his voice layered with echoes that sounded both mournful and malevolent. "But you didn't break the curse. You've only passed it on. Jonathan." My voice faltered as tears blurred my vision. "I did this for you. I thought you were warned," he interrupted, his hollow eyes narrowing. "This curse isn't mine to bear. It was never about me." The words hit me like a blow. I staggered back, my breath forming shallow clouds in the icy air. Behind him, the mist thickened, forming shapes. More shadows, more figures, all warped and unnatural. They moved toward me, their movements slow and deliberate, their forms flickering as if caught between worlds. I turned to run, but the snow beneath me shifted, pulling at my feet like quicksand. The air grew colder, each breath slicing through my chest. A low hum began to rise, the same melody I had played on the violin, now distorted and fragmented, echoing in the night. "Your soul is marked," Jonathan said, his voice softening for a fleeting moment. "I tried to protect you, but the curse, it demands more. It always will." The mist surged forward, wrapping around me like icy tendrils. Shadows clawed at my vision, their cold, spectral fingers brushing against my skin. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the snow, the night itself conspiring to drown me in its suffocating stillness. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. I was alone again, the graveyard silent and empty, as if nothing had happened. The snow was undisturbed, the grave intact, and the violin, still broken, lay at my feet. But something was different. As I stumbled back toward the house, the melody began to play again, faint and distant, as though carried on the wind. It wasn't Jonathan's playing. It was mine. The realization clawed at my mind as I reached my front door. My shadow stretched across the snow, impossibly long and distorted, twisting unnaturally as the tune grew louder. It followed me inside, where the air was heavy with the scent of burnt wood and decay. The violin case was back in the corner, perfectly intact. The strings gleamed in the dim light, taut and waiting. The curse hadn't ended. It had only just begun.